Okay, we're now live. I'm just going to give it a few moments for people to join and then we'll go ahead and get started. Right, I see I'm filling in. Give it another minute. All right, we can go ahead and get started, and I'm sure people will continue to join over the first few minutes. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to have you here with us for our School Business Administrator Roundtable. Leading the discussion today will be our government audit partners, Valerie Dolan, Mon Lee, and Heidi Walleb, who many of you already know and work with. We are also pleased to welcome our guest presenters, Melissa Beatty and Renee Metzger, who are going to share valuable insights with you from their school district's perspective. And I will now turn it over to Valerie Dolan to introduce the session and kick off today's discussion. If you guys have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A feature and we will get to all of your questions, hopefully. So with that, Valerie, please take it away.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. We appreciate everyone taking time out. One of the things that have come up a lot when we're getting ready to do the audit is all of the common audit findings that we do find. So we were discussing putting together a little bit of a panel here about various common audit findings. So can you go to the next slide, Katie? Thanks. So really in that first area we were going to talk about are the areas where we felt that these are the insights are common audit pitfalls. One of them are in the areas of bank reconciliations, payroll agencies, student activities, transfers, including your preschool education, and extraordinary aid. Additionally, we're going to talk about some best practices from monthly reporting, some documentations, and leave some time for open discussions and questions. So really the first piece that we wanted to cover today was really in the area of the working relationship and bank reconciliations between the business administrator and the treasurer of school monies. So like I said, we have two BAs, assistant BAs that are here with us. I do want to give you a little bit of background on both of them. We do have Renee Metzger. Renee has been the School Business Administrator Board Secretary for Stillwater Township School District for over 14 years, where she oversees budgeting, financial operations, audits, and compliance. Prior to this role, she was an Assistant Business Administrator in Hackettstown and in Greene, building that strong foundation in finance and operations. Beyond her full-time role, she also is currently the Treasurer of School Monies in 8 school districts, and has provided considerable consulting services to a number of school districts, assisting with financial cleanup and serving as interim business administrators when needed. Her extensive experience does make her well-versed in financial challenges and the schools face. Additionally, she is a certified mentor with the New Jersey Schools Business Administrators, helping develop new professionals. Thank you for attending, Renee. Additionally, we have Melissa Beatty. Melissa Beatty is currently the Assistant Business Administrator for Fair Lawn Board of Education, a role she's had since July of 2002. She also serves as the Treasurer of School Monies for South Orange Maplewood Board of Education. Prior to her current role, she spent 9 years as the Supervisor of Accounting for Montclair Board of Education, where she managed the financial reporting and accounting operations. She also has a strong background in audit, having spent 7 of her first 7 years with Nisivoccia as an auditor in our auditing of schools, municipalities, counties, and libraries, with extensive experience in school and finance. Melissa brings valuable expertise for us for the roundtable. So I appreciate both of them for joining us. One of the first things we do want to talk about is, as we said, the business administrator and the treasurer partnership. We look at these roles as more of a partnership, not 2 independent positions. So obviously, as we said, there should be clear communication and partnership between these 2 advisors to ensure that there's financial accuracy and compliance. So we talk about ways of having collaboration for clear, accurate financials. You know, we really do want, that's what we're looking for. So once you've established the roles of each of these 2, we really think that you could align and get the best use of the reports that they can generate. So I guess Melissa or Renee, if you want to jump in and talk about where we see the different roles of a business administrator versus a treasurer and what you think would be the best assistance that can be provided.
So for the BA responsibilities, make sure when, at the end of the month, you want to review your bank statements. There's a lot of different transactions that might come in through the state as ACHs, things going out, maybe health benefits that are set normal. So make sure those get recorded. A lot of the systems, depending on which accounting system you use, do have self reconciliation checkpoints. So it's a nice double check before you actually go to close out your month to make sure you're not missing anything. You want to monitor all your fund allocations, make sure they're hitting the correct funds. If you have different checks coming out of cafeteria or payroll, hitting your general fund and cafeteria, make sure that they're allocated correctly. You want to complete any of your expense transfers, and I think we're going to be going into that a little bit later, but you want to make sure you don't have any negative accounts in any of your available balances. And also review your board secretary report for accuracy. Look at your trial balances, make sure that the numbers make sense and that they're realistic, and also provide your reports for the treasurer.
Yeah.
And I know.
So typically when I send my reports to our treasurer here, we always make sure that we send the bank statements. We always make sure that we send a receipt report or deposit report. I usually send a check register by fund, but also by check number, so that posting it by fund is much easier than trying to sort it when it's not. Any journal entries that would affect cash. So, when you get your audit entries, if anything's going to affect cash, then the treasurer needs to be aware of that so that they can adjust the cash on their end accordingly. If you reclassify any checks during the month from, say, Fund 10 to Fund 20 or Fund 20 to Fund 10, you need to inform your treasurer so that they can also adjust their cash accordingly. And then I always send a trial balance report along with the board secretary's report to the treasurer so that they can make sure that they are tying out to the same numbers.
And like we say, you should always work with each treasurer too, because make sure the treasurer is getting the right reports. So the business office and the treasurer should work together to determine what are going to be my standard reports. What reports do I find most useful? Which ones are? Because we do find that, like Melissa says, a number of times there are cash adjustments. And sometimes those items just they get caught up in between the two reports as not being as reconciling items. So we also say there's some best practices. Obviously, you should always have best practices with reporting. Obviously, let's submit our reports on time. I don't know what time this, I guess maybe Renee or Melissa, you can talk to what's the timing of reporting. What do you think is the best time process? How does that work?
Again, the report should be approved by your board within 60 days of month's end. I usually try to always encourage the BAs to get your treasurer's reports and your board secretary's reports done every 30 days. Keep on that monthly cycle. This way you're caught up in time and you're not rushing. Also, give your treasurer the time to be able to do the reports, and it gives time too to then have that communication with the treasurer and the business administrator to go back and forth and maybe fix something in that current month so that you don't have any adjustments. So the more time you give each other, the better I think it is, and the better communication and cleaner reports you're going to get.
Agreed.
Yep. And then the other area that I think is the biggest one that we see are the adjustments. So one of the things is the treasurer will have a number of adjustments or reconciling items. How do you handle those going forward? And so that one of you both talk to that.
So I typically review the bank statements just to make sure that if there's a reconciling item, we clear it up by the end of the school year. I don't necessarily clean them up every single month because sometimes they do clear on their own. You forget to record something and then you record it the next month, so it clears the next month. But by the end of the year, you should know what's going to clear and what's not, so that you can work with the treasurer to clear those off the bank statement by year end, so it's clean for the auditors.
Right, because I think as the auditors, we come in and I think we probably could say that there are a lot of reconciling items that are unaddressed.
Mhm.
And, a lot of times they're payroll, there are other things, and they never get addressed. So how do you handle getting those addressed in your system?
I really try to, again, work with the BA and if I'm their treasurer, I really try to work with BA and I try to get them to do them, clean up the adjustments more on a monthly basis or at least bi-monthly so that you're not fixing adjustments all the way back from July in June, because at that point you may forget exactly what happened with that adjustment. So I always try to, again, just communicate, give them time to fix it in the current month. So there are maybe no adjustments, but sometimes you can't help the adjustments. So I do try to get them to do it a little bit more frequently, and not wait till just the end of the year. Because then when the auditors ask, what's this adjustment for? You have to go back to all your emails and try to refresh your memory and things like that. It does get difficult.
Right, because that is a common, and that is actually a common recommendation that we do include in our audits. There's a large number of reconciling items on bank recs. There's stale dated outstanding checks. There's possibly deposits that are listed as deposits in transit when in fact they don't clear within a reasonable amount of time after the month end. So yes, as the auditor side, we definitely see a lot of comments related to those areas because we see them, and sometimes we look at the treasurer's report in June and then we come back a year later and we look at the next treasurer's report and we're still carrying the adjustments from 2 years ago, 3 years ago. At some point they have to get resolved and process the adjustments.
And also remember, some of these adjustments might affect when you're developing your next year's budget. You have to put in your February 1 numbers, and I just worked with another district to kind of fix some things from the prior year, and it did affect their February 1 numbers. So it's important to get those auditing adjustment entries in and make sure everything looks good, because that also could impact, your following year's budget development cycle.
So, and then I guess if we want to shift to the next slide, Katie, one of the things that we had kind of touched on a little bit was effective communication. Obviously, the day-to-day receipts and disbursements are pretty self-explanatory, but we all know, as in this world, day-to-day does not happen. Like there's a lot of things that always happen unique. There's always some check that's got a question. I mean, as the auditors, I know we get a number of questions about how to handle an adjustment or how to correct something. So then, what type of documentation do you use to talk about with between the two offices? What's unique? What are those adjustments? Because, that's what we see is sometimes something and that data is never communicated. So the treasurer has no idea and they just record it as a reconciling item. So
yeah, and I see this, Val, happen a lot with the payroll items. If you're doing a manual check for payroll, if you don't provide that information to the treasurer right away, they may not know that there was a manual check written if it didn't cash that month. The other common thing that I'm currently seeing is with all these ROD grants going over to Fund 30, and discussing with your treasurer to make sure that you guys agree on the cash moving over and things like that. So again, it goes back to that communication. And it helps both parties out to just say, hey, heads up, this happened this month. It's a big time saver. And again, it stops a lot of the unknown adjustments maybe at the end of the year as well.
Yeah, and when I'm doing my reconciliation with the treasurer, if something pops up, I'm always communicating with them via email, hey, FYI, this popped up this month. So, you may have to make an adjustment on your end for this, or I need to make an adjustment on my end, but it happened this month, but I'm going to post it for next month. So that they can make sure that they're adjusting their records accordingly. So.
Right. And like the other side of it, we do say like the business office should be monitoring it, but there are a number of BAs like yourselves who are treasurer school monies. So it is also partially the responsibility of the treasurer school monies to like notify them and say, hey, I keep carrying these reconciling items.
Mhm.
You know, not just keep putting it on there. A number of times the treasurer just puts those adjustments on
Mhm.
and never communicates back the other way to the business office. Yes, the business office should be proactive looking at those reconciling items, but the whole point of the treasurer of school money's position is the checks and balances.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that if you're the treasurer of school monies, you're communicating adjustments to your business office. I think that's a step that does get missed a lot. I don't
Mhm.
know, that we see where the treasurer just keeps marking things down, or the treasurers and the cash just doesn't work, so they just adjust.
Mhm.
That's a system of checks and balances. It's there from an internal control standpoint. So really the treasurer should speak up and say, hey, this is the third month in a row I've had this adjustment.
Yeah. Mhm.
Don't be afraid as the treasurer, because I know a number of BAs are treasurers. It is partially your responsibility to tell them also.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I'll even, ask BAs, do you need help with an entry? Here's the entry. Again, each kind of accounting system's a little bit different on how you might do specific entries. But, we know what the end result maybe should be. And we discuss that to make sure we agree on what the adjustment cleanup should be. But it's highly important for your treasurer to communicate those adjustments with you as well.
So then brings us to like those adjustments. We do talk about a lot of these adjustments. A lot of people like to do big lump adjustments. Lump adjustments, I would say, become very cumbersome because when you try to pull them apart. So while it seems like it's much easier to do something as a lump, sometimes 3 transactions make things 3 self-explanatory a little bit better. So how do you all handle that? Are you guys a common lump adjuster, or do you feel that recording things separately seems to
I
make more
like to
sense?
record things separately just so that, as we get older, our mind goes and we don't remember what we did. So, if I lump it all together, then I'm not necessarily gonna remember right away what all of those adjustments were. So, to do them individually, you can, depending on your software, you can put a memo, for the adjustment that you would understand what that adjustment was for, so that it's not a mystery, when it gets questioned by the auditor or somebody else.
Right. And like we always say, all the adjustments should just be in the next month
Mhm.
because you don't want to go backwards.
Mhm.
We get this question a lot as auditors. When should we post our audit adjustments? We would say, if there was something major and material, you might have to unclose the records to fix something, but most of them are just audit entries and
Mhm.
can be made at whatever month you're recording them. Otherwise, if you go backwards, you have to get those all reapproved.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
So,
And a lot of times I see as a treasurer, I'll start the reconciliation and then I'm off on cash, and you have to figure out where you're off on the cash. And now I'm getting used to, okay, well, can you rerun this report? And I'm like, oh, cash changed in a prior month after we reconciled. So it's important to not make those changes because it does affect the treasurer's reports going forward as well, and the board secretary. So, and then you're reapproving the reports like Valerie said. So again, it's just much cleaner to, fix everything in a future month.
correct. And then, like we
Yes.
always say, document everything. Like at the moment, it seemed clear as day as to what you were doing. Think about 14 things happened. By tomorrow, it's probably now mud in your head. So we always say it's always better to document why you're doing something, the reasoning, put the support with it. A lot of times you pull up a print, you look at your screen and you realize what it is. Print it, keep track of it. Even if it's a PDF, save it to a PDF, because inevitably that adjustment, I don't know how it is, it's the auditor way. It's the one thing I'm going to ask you.
Yeah.
It always seems to happen. Melissa, wearing your hat as an auditor, knows that you could do 1,000 things and one thing wrong, and I'm going to pick that one
Yep. Always.
randomly, right?
I always maintain like a monthly folder. So like all of my backup for my receipts are in there, all of my dispersed, like I would keep a check journal in there, but any adjustment that I would make. So when I get for example, if I get the audit adjustments in December, and I made those entries in December, I would print a copy, mark up which ones I I entered and keep that in my monthly folder so that, you know, if somebody came in at the year end and said, well, what's this adjustment that happened in December? I could just pull the folder out and say, here you go. Here's the backup for why this was.
I do the exact same thing, and I also have a binder, so it depends which district I'm in, but it's the same organization. And this way you just flip to the month as soon as the auditor asks, and you're like, oh, there it is. That's what I did.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think that makes the most sense, you know, and
Yeah.
to us, from an auditing standpoint, I feel like that's a lot easier because then you could almost just in advance give us your monthly folders. And then
Yeah.
we can do digging through those folders, looking for things that we might have, or we might have a question. And inevitably, I know sometimes, oh, that's what they were trying to accomplish. Let me see, because I'm looking at it and, you know, sometimes things get in there in the system, they don't work right, or they went the wrong way in the system and I'm chasing it. What was trying to happen? Sometimes I just need to know what was trying to happen so that the auditors can understand what's going on. Because at the end of the day, we're reporting the year to date, you're living it every day. So, and it does get complicated. And sometimes audits don't start until not even, like you might be doing this in June. We're not even getting there until October. It might have been a year ago. You know, so a lot of times we may be asking you a question for something you did a year ago. So we've always said that's the best option. We do have a slide that just really talks about deadlines, which, you know, Renee kind of touched on that, you know, you are required to have your monthly board secretary and treasurer's reports approved by your board within 60 days of month end. So that actually is a common recommendation too, that's
Except
not
for June.
happening. Yeah,
Except for June, that has to be the county within 30.
there you go. See, except for June. And, you know, we always say that's right. You know, make sure that you're reviewing those two reports. Are they agreeing? You know, I can't tell you how many times we get a board secretary's report, they're not even in balance. You know, look at those reports, review those reports before you even put them to your board. Do they make sense? Do they tie? Because ultimately, that's the cross check between those two reports. Obviously, you have two reporting that are due. There is a report that's due to the county and in December and another one in June. There are deadlines for those. December is by
It's 60 days.
60 days and June is 30.
Yeah.
You know, and
Makes
the
no
county,
sense.
well, and the county will tell you, you can send them draft. You know, a lot of people will be like, I'm not quite done. Send them a draft. Let them know that you're only that, you know, we're working on a draft. You know, they're always saying. And then obviously the biggest one for the auditors is process our audit adjustments. You'd be surprised how many clients don't actually ever post our entries. You know, we go into a district and last year's, the first entry I have to make is to post last year's entries because they're never in there or they're not adjusted. And especially with an auditor entry that relates to cash, which does happen more than not between 10 and 20, between 10 and 30 a lot recently. A lot of cash between the funds happens. That needs to be communicated to your treasurer also, that you're making a cash entry from the auditors so that you can make sure that everybody's on the same page, everybody's in the same place.
And Val, I usually have our BAs send me their auditing adjusting entries as a treasurer. This way I can compare too and make sure that the entries did hit correctly in the system. So I think that's important too, to share that information with the treasurer.
Yeah, and I do have a number of districts who also, you know, depending on their software, share them with their software vendor to make sure that they're posting them. Because, you know, the auditors don't make certain, like we make entries to balance sheet only. So sometimes we can't make the entry the way it needs. We'll give you an entry, but that's probably may or may not be the way you have to post it. So sometimes if there's a question on an entry, I do think you need to sometimes reach out to the software vendor. There has been times to say, hey, how do I post this without messing up everything, right? You know, because that's what happens also. Some entries can get communicated, but I agree. Send the same adjustments to the treasurer. I mean, the treasurer's job is not just to do the bank recs, it's really to be that check. It is your internal control. It is your cross check. You know, the districts that have one, it's there for a reason. It's a strategic position. So they should be looking at those entries, seeing what kind of changes.
Yeah. And I usually make sure that they're posted in the month they receive them and not all the way back to July. Because if you
Correct.
change, you go back to July, then you have to have all your reports redone.
Yep. That's why we try to get most of the entries, you know, the audit deadline is tight, but we usually try to get all of our entries done so that your December reporting, hopefully by December, has most audit journal entries. Obviously, with the delays that we've faced for the last couple of years, it was January and sometimes February for those entries, but, you know, I try to get them as soon as we're done with audit. You should be getting your entries when you get your audit, so that you get them in those same months, I mean, or that next month that you're working on. Because sometimes we get them and you've already started the process for that close, pack it up on the following month, but they should be in and approved. So, because you are signing off, when you sign off on the draft, you're signing off on the entries. So we make sure that you have questions on the entries. So now, before we jump on anything, does anybody have, I don't see any question and answers on on anyone for any of these with the board, the business office and treasurer, but feel free to add to the comments if you want to put anything on here, or if you'd like to discuss anything further. We have a question and answer section later. So we're jumping into transfers.
Yes, hi, I'm Heidi, and I'm gonna be covering transfers, general fund transfers, and then PEA or preschool education transfers. So as you know, every month you have to do a transfer report, or it prints out of your system, and these are the key ones you need to keep an eye out for. If you transfer any funds to administrative accounts over 10%, general administration, school administration, central services, admin, info tech. And then also if you transfer money to capital outlay, and I think from capital outlay as well, except for equipment. And then if there is any line item transfers from any general fund appropriation account that exceed 10%, these are the ones that you need county approval for. So, and then please keep documentation that you send it to the county for approval, because if they haven't replied back, but it's 10 days go by, then you can assume that they've approved that. But we would need to see documentation of that. So please keep a copy of the email. So I am going to share a worksheet.
And Heidi, it's 10% of the transfers going out of the account that just need the county approval. Except for admin is in and out,
Okay. So,
right?
so here I have some examples of the transfer. So here's one in regular programs. So what I did is I took the transfer form that's on DOE's website. I know each of the softwares have one. And then I gave you an example of ones, anything that shows up in red here is where the county superintendent approval is required. So for the instructional line items, when it's from over the 10%, it needs approval. And then same thing down here for some of the support services. And then here we have the admin ones. So we have one that's under the 10%, so it's not flagged as red. And then here we have the over 10%, so that's flagged as red. And then also down here, facilities acquisition and construction services, which is capital outlay other than equipment. It's over, and it's not even the 10%, it's any amount. So here we only have $1,500 and it's showing up as red. So you need the county approval. So Renee, did I answer your question through this?
Yeah, I remember the county saying sometimes they were BAs were sending the transfer report for even 10% in for the approvals.
No, it's just 10% out.
It's 10% out, except for capital. You'd be surprised how many
Yes.
people miss the capital.
Mhm.
Because like Heidi's saying in her is that even that small 1,500, because it's all capital. So that gets missed a lot in the transfers.
Right.
Is, oh, well, I wasn't at 10%, but it does jump, that it does require the approval.
And I just changed it to a minus in the capital outlay too, and it shows up as a red flag. So yeah, it's really only the admin costs, general, school administration, and they combine together central services and admin, info tech. That's where you're gonna see like the two that's requiring the approval. So I'm gonna stop sharing this one and then Katie, if we can move along to the preschool education transfers.
Yes, let me pull that up.
There was a
Okay.
quick question in the chat
Okay,
on regarding the transfers. So any line that has a transfer of 10% out needs county approval? Correct, right? I just want to confirm that is the correct answer.
Yes.
And if it's in or out for anything for capital, and then admin is,
admin is,
right,
It's in. If you
admin is
transfer
in,
into admin over 10%, you
Yep.
need the approval.
but if you
Right.
transfer out of any line, you're welcome. Gotta thank you for clarification.
The one thing with transfer too is like sometimes you would notice that if you did a withdrawal from capital reserve and it gets added to your capital, like your Fund 12 budget, is sometimes obviously you're going to exceed that 10%. Usually I would, there's leeways with that because you did get board approval and it's transferred out of capital reserve into capital outlay. So I don't really, necessarily ask you if you have county approval for that.
yeah, you just want to check with the county on that, but if you look at the transfer report, it does allow for a column for revenues added. But like Mon said, anytime it's something with capital outlay, you just want to double check with the county to be on the safe side. And then preschool education, a lot of more districts are participating in preschool education every year. And I don't think it's really that clear that the fact that there are times when you have to actually have transfers approved for preschool education, and they're nowhere near as similar to what the general fund transfers are. So we just wanted to bring this up, and they have a different time frame as to when they have to be approved by. They have to all be submitted by May 31st. And it also goes to the county, but then it goes to the state for approval. So, and I know I've been at some recent ASBO meetings and there's a lot of discussion about preschool education just in general. So these are the ones that require the county superintendent and then department approval. If you eliminate any funding that's allocated to a line, so say, for example, you have instructional supplies and you had 5,000 budgeted and you totally remove the 5,000 out of there, then that would require the approval. Or the same thing for support services. If there was a support line item, say, for supplies as well, and you took out all of that, then that would need approval. And then if you transfer money from an instruction line item to a support services line item, that also needs approval. And then any transfer into facilities acquisition and construction from either instruction or support services, that needs approval. And Katie, if I could share, I'm going to bring up the preschool. So here is, no, that doesn't look like what I'm looking for. Okay. Sorry. I don't know why. Oh, here we go. Oh, right. So this is from DOE's website about review and approval and completion of the form. So there's some instructions there. And then I'm going to stop sharing that.
Does it have a specific preschool transfer form different
Yes, I
than
was
the
going to bring that up as
1701?
well. Yeah,
Okay.
I just wanted to bring up.
I thought there was.
So open that first so we get the right one. And then I'll share that. So here's the form, and it's a 2-page form, and you have to fill in this information. And then here's the second form where they give you more details. So please make sure, like I said, if you have any that need approval, that you submit that by May 31st. So I'm gonna stop sharing that. So let me just double check and see if there's any questions in. Okay, yes, those have been answered already. Thank you. And then I guess we're gonna be moving on to extraordinary aid.
All right, I'll go over extraordinary aid. So with the last couple of years, a lot of districts has gotten a lot more money in extraordinary aid because they increased the reimbursement percentage. So was it 2 years ago? It was 90%, and then last year was 60 something percent. This year, I'm sure it will go down again. For how much? Not sure. Is it going to go back down to the original 40%? Who knows? So I guess we'll all find out in May, the end of May. But because of the increase in the reimbursement for extraordinary aid, we had to do a lot more single audit testing in terms of just specifically for extraordinary aid because they're over the $750,000 threshold. So as a result of that, we are noticing a lot of findings related to extraordinary aid. So we want to kind of review it with everybody to make everybody aware, and maybe even, chime in from Renee and Melissa about how they can go about correcting the recommendations. So one of the findings that we noticed in the last couple of years is intensive services that's claimed on the application doesn't always necessarily match what's in the student's IEP. So for extraordinary aid, if you read through their instruction manual from the state, DOE, basically the student's IEP is the Bible, quote unquote Bible, right? That's the source document. So if it's documented in the IEP, then it means that they're qualified for intensive services. If it's not documented, there's no other proof that we have that they either received their extraordinary aid or they even qualify for it. So I think we've noticed a lot of times that for some reason, those IEPs aren't being updated. The services might have been provided, but maybe the wrong option got picked in when it's, whoever updated IEPs or they weren't updated. So that's something to watch out for. Another area that we found was the related service costs. So you are allowed to, when you do the reporting, because that's done in May and that's before the end of the year, to put an estimate in there. However, it needs to be a reasonable estimate. So for example, if you have a nursing contract for one of the students, right? And for the whole year, it's making up a number, $25,000. But then so that's the number that you report because that's what's in the PO, that's the open PO amount. But then you don't factor in that, well, that student withdrew from nursing services and they only received it for maybe half of the year. So now you have an excess of 50%. So you're supposed to go back and revise your extraordinary application, or at least when you do your estimate, it needs to be a reasonable estimate. The cost of an instructional aid was duplicated. We just noticed that in certain instances that depending on how the backup calculation was done, it's hard when, I think for the business office, when the special services team puts together all the backup calculation, because they don't necessarily get the information from the business office. A lot of times they will pull the information themselves, or they'll have a spreadsheet, but then they have no, 3 months later when we do the audit, they have no idea how they did the calculation. So I think it's very important that even if the business office doesn't prepare the calculation, they should get involved in maybe just overlooking it, helping them with the calculation so that they know that it's being done right. Okay, additional costs for speech and counseling therapies. Oh, okay, so depending on how you do your extra cost reporting, right? Because some districts don't put it in there because it's a lot, it is a lot of work. And other districts do go student by student, look at IEP and say, okay, this person receives group therapy, X amount of time, X amount of week, and then do a calculation based on that. So when we do the testing, we'll notice that it doesn't necessarily always agree to, oh, because everybody was just calculate based on assuming that this person did it every single week, but in the IEP, for example, it has a different type of frequency. So that's just something that would be aware too. Melissa, seems like you want to say something.
Yeah, so I usually would calculate the cost for the instructional aid. I would use the average salary for all of the instructional aides we have on staff, and then add into that the cost of the FICA, the cost of the DCRP, because generally they're enrolled in DCRP, and tack that on, and then give them a standard dollar amount to use when claiming an aid. And then the same for the therapies. So speech, OT, PT, if I have those individuals on staff, I will average out those salaries and then assign a cost to those and provide that like a list of the costs to the special services department, so that when they're doing the application, they have a standardized formula that's used to calculate those costs. And I found that was easier than having them calculate something that they really don't know how to calculate.
Katie, can you go to, oh, we're on this. Okay, so that's kind of what you just touched on, the first point there. We do get asked questions a lot. Should we use, because some districts will be saying, okay, this student received aid from this person, help from this person from this personal aid, and this person's salary is this amount. So this is the cost for this one student, versus if you do an average, is a much easier. I do agree with that. Costs for certain services were overstated, while some of the costs were understated. So this is kind of going back to what we, already highlighted. It's just making sure that the documentation that for all the calculation is kept on file, because that's the other thing that we always have a difficult time when we try to audit the program, is that when you go back to the child study team, the special services team, and ask them, well, how did you calculate this number, that number? Nobody seems to remember.
Yeah.
And as it was pointed out earlier, as we get older, our minds go, right? So it's very hard to remember what exactly goes in that particular calculation. So it's best to have all the paperwork documented and kept on file.
So, sorry, I just want to, when I have a vendor that's an outside vendor doing therapies with the students, I would usually provide the child study team with the cost up to a certain point and then have an estimate for the rest of the year, so that that's the dollar amount that's claimed. So if we have an outside nurse coming in because we just don't have the nursing on staff and the student needs a one-to-one nurse, what is the total cost that we have actually paid through, say, May 1st, and then estimate out from May and June.
Two questions have come up in the chat. The first one is, can you claim costs under X-aid if they were also claimed under IDEA? Under the FAQ, it appears to be yes. So I just want to make sure, is that correct? That Melissa and Renee, maybe you chime in more than even us. Are you allowed to claim them in two places?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And then the other one is, isn't the extraordinary service based upon a one-to-one aid? So wouldn't you want to use the one-to-one aid salary?
Well, if Mrs. Jones is out 5 days, I'm not gonna go in and see who filled in for her for 5 days. So that's why I usually average out the
Do an
salaries.
average? Okay.
Yeah,
I've noticed it depends. I won't go that detailed and be like, oh, the sub was there for 5 days and subtract the salary. I would just take the salary for the year. But I do notice, at least in my district, our part-time aides might be with a student for, say, 2 periods a day, and they kind of rotate through for certain students of ours. So that's where I would take the average of the, say, aides that were with that student. But if it's a one-to-one where I have a full-time aide on a specific student, I will just assign that one aide
You'll
for
just
that
assign the
specific
aide?
student.
Yeah, so I think it really depends, but I think
Yeah.
it comes back to document what you did.
Mhm. Exactly. Have that backup. I put it all in the folder with each, I have a nice shared spreadsheet that I work with the CST department. So I can help fill in the cost and things, and we can agree on the numbers and the services and the amount of time. So they really fill in the services and I fill in the finance part, and then we submit it kind of together. So again, it goes back to that effective communication.
Also, like in the manual itself, right? It towards the beginning, it lists what the intensive services include. And yes, the 101A is an intensive service, but if you have a student that receives multiple related services that exceeds certain number of hours um, for the year, then it qualifies as intensive services. And if that person happens to have maybe not a 101A, like a 50% A or something, so that person will, you can still calculate that cost. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be a one-on-one aid. So I think that's it in terms of extraordinary aid.
One more
Covered.
question just
Stephanie?
came in, Mon.
Oh,
Can you-
okay.
And I think, so you can claim, I guess the question, they just want to confirm that we can claim in IDEA and X-aid, and that's not considered double dipping.
correct.
Correct.
It's not like semi makes you separate the two.
Correct. But under these two, you can.
Yes.
I think that's the only grant that we know of
I've
that
ever seen double
the
dipping.
state basically tells you can do that.
Let's not tell anybody.
All right, so we had a roundtable back in, I guess it was 2 years ago now, wow, that Caitlin did, but on tips on preparing your application. So it's pretty extensive. If you need kind of a refresher before you do your next application, there's a link here. So when the session ends and Katie sends out the presentation to everybody, then you can have access to that.
All right, as we said, this is another area that we have now seemed more and more common of recommendations coming in, and it's in the area of payroll agency. Obviously, payroll agency is reconciled on a monthly basis, but as with any agency funds, those funds are allocated for a specific reason. So really, you are required, we ask, we say we need one at the end of the year. You should be preparing this on a monthly basis, an analysis of your balance, because inevitably payroll adjustments happen. Everyone knows that payroll doesn't perfectly wash. What comes in does not always go out, and things do get adjusted. So really, you should be preparing when you're doing your payroll bank rec, you should be preparing an analysis of agency balance that details that. Melissa, you have a spreadsheet, or Katie, can you pull up Melissa's? Melissa has a couple of options I think she's done over the years, or things to that nature on that analysis.
Yeah, so depending on the software that everyone uses, my current software, I run all of the receipts and disbursements through a trial balance. So my trial balance is my analysis of balance. But in the past, I haven't had that. So I had developed a spreadsheet, which is up on the screen, that it basically details every single deduction code that would show up on your payroll summary reports. And I would record the receipts. And then when I would do the disbursements, I would record the disbursements from using the check register against those deduction codes. So for instance, you record all of your pension receipts. And then when you go to make your pension payment, I would just post all of the disbursements against each code as is applicable. You know, sometimes your pennies off or things of that nature. I would go back and look at these every once in a while and just try to clear them so they're not sitting there as negatives balances.
Because that's the common, that's where the entry usually comes in on a recommendation side is this analysis may be prepared, but nobody's addressing the issues of negatives, positives. You know, there are interest earnings. Are they transferred over? Were those moved to the general fund if need be? Are those pension payments, if there's balances at the end of the month, especially at June, are they payments that you're going to be making in the subsequent month? Or is there a problem? Did you miss something? I know DCRP has a lag a lot of times.
Yeah.
Because registering people for DCRP has a problem. And the biggest one that we see as auditors, I don't know, Mon and Heidi can chime in on this one, is actually in the area of unemployment. Under GASB 84, when we did that, unemployment is now recorded in the like they used to be as part of your payroll in the H's. Unemployment is now reported in the general fund on your C1. If there are balances sitting in your payroll agency that have not been transferred to your unemployment trust fund at the end of the year, they don't get reported properly because they're reported as a payable on the balance sheet rather than a fund balance, reserve fund balance. So that one has become a bigger problem than most people before. It used to be part of your payroll and was unemployment or it wasn't. So really what we suggest is, you know, we talked before this, when we were putting together a presentation on how do you do it monthly? Do you do it quarterly? Should you clean up maybe sometime in April and May? You know, what is the best, I mean, is really probably best practices for anyone is individually different, but unemployment, I think, needs to be looked at because a lot of times that's getting missed and it's running large balances.
Yeah, so I personally do transfer my SUI and my FLI deductions to my unemployment account on every payroll. You know, I have done it in the past on a, you know, different basis. I've done it quarterly, monthly, whatever, but I tend to do it, you know, as I'm doing my payroll transfers in the bank and I'm transferring, you know, my net payroll, my payroll agency, my employer share of FICA, my employer share of DCRP, I just add one more transfer and transfer my SUI and my FLI. So that's just my standard 5 payroll transfers every payroll. And then, you know, and at month end, then I transfer my employer share of health benefit contributions back to general fund. So month end, I added a 6th transfer. So those are just my standard deductions. You know, all of these are straight from our payroll registers, except for if you look at line 27, I have an employer share of DCRP.
That was the next question that just popped in, Melissa. How do you handle employer share of DCRP?
Yeah, so I have a line there for employer share of DCRP, and then again under federal, I also have employer share of FICA. So those are just manual adjustments that are not going to show up on your payroll registers, but I also record them here because they flow through the agency account.
Thank you. I was like, that was a question was going to be, how do you get those on there to report them? They're not through your payroll. They're just memo entries, but you wanted the whole picture. Yeah.
And with my software that I have now with journal entries, the way that I have CSI. So when I post a disbursement in the personnel side under agency, it posts the corresponding receipt on the budget side. So on the budget side, as the disbursement comes over to be posted, it also posts the receipt. But the one thing that doesn't post is the employer share of DCRP or the employer share of FICA. Those I manually post. And there's 2 ways that I could have posted them. You could do a journal entry and just post it against cash and then the corresponding balance sheet account. Or you can do an adjustment to CSI's got it's almost like a purchase order payment screen for those accounts. And you just do an adjustment to the balance there and it records a deposit.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So then, Katie, can you bring back up the presentation?
Yes.
So now one of the last areas that we wanted to cover is the last recommendation, which is the one that I see the most is student activities. We look at student activities and we actually say there's probably two versions that are floating out there. Centralized, meaning they're within your board office, they fall under the control of the board office, or they're more decentralized where those records are maintained outside of the business office and are at those respective schools. They're run by the secretaries, the principals have ultimate responsibility. You know, obviously, once it's inside your board office, control falls under line as everything else that you do in the board office. So you do see less recommendations. Not a proponent of bringing more work into the business office. So if you are going to, we usually see most of those recommendations usually get found in the area of what we would call the decentralized records. And they're honestly often repeat comments. Obviously, when you go into CUSAC, one of the things they do look at and document are those repeat uncorrected recommendations. So we're highlighting in this area that this is really an area where we can do an audit, and every year for the last 10 years, this recommendation is sitting in your audit. So, you know, I know it's hard to say, but once you say, well, that's the schools, it's not me, it still shows up in the audit and the board office and the business office ends up answering to it in the CUSAC form. But really, when you talk about it, it is in the decentralized. So what I did is, so you know, the next slide. So really the recommendations I looked at and I said, they really do fall into what I would say 3 common recommendations. One of them is timeliness of deposits, proper support and documentation of all the disbursements, and monthly bank reconciliations. My guess is somewhere along the line, those are the 3 main areas that student activity recommendations kind of always circle around. So I say my gut answer is to always say when your district is decentralized, you really should come up with at least what I would say is a formal manual, formal procedures that those schools, whether it's 1 building, 2 building, 14 buildings, they all follow the same rules. Just because they're decentralized doesn't mean they shouldn't be standardized. So what I would do is you create a manual that requires the documents to be maintained for all cash receipts, noting the date of receipt and the deposit date. Obviously, when they create something, it becomes to ensure the timeliness of that deposit so that they are deposited within a reasonable amount of time. 48 hours is usually the benchmark. Document an approval process for all cash disbursements. You know, make sure they have, I don't care if it's a full voucher system. I have a district that uses a little piece of paper where there are approvals on it. That ensures that you have, and it's attached to a purchase order. Same concept. It ensures there's proper support and approvals for all of those disbursements. Then they should come up with some record that have a manner of tracking all the monthly receipts and disbursements so that formal bank reconciliations can be prepared. That way, that resolves the 3rd recommendation. When you standardize these records, I think you would see that a lot of these recommendations can get resolved or will show you where they are. So when they, you know, we put it back and you can go to the board, you know, I know with us, sometimes we might just say that student activities in the report might not be following the policies or procedures, but we're not specific. You can usually go back to the auditor and say, okay, which school's not following? And if we have some semblance of standardization a little bit, we can say this building and this building never deposit on time. This building never does a bank rec. One of the other steps that we suggest from a control standpoint is to ask them to submit their monthly records to you. Just ask them to send you a monthly bank rec and maybe that tracking of receipts and disbursements. Doesn't mean you have to do anything, but the fact that they're sending something to you on a monthly basis means that at least you know it's being done. We found when districts start doing that and asking them to just send them to you, then they're going to start to call you with questions. Hey, I don't know how to do this bank rec, or this bank rec isn't working. I can't get mine to work. Then at least you're addressing them. You know, I always talk about a formal policy, and then I flash back to Melissa. Melissa created a formal policy that I think I have a red line version of it that I send out to a number of people when they ask me. You know, she created a policy, still can't get adherence, but she has an actual written policy. But then you can, at least you know that it's happening. I think that half the battle with student activities is it's removed from your office. And when you bring it back in just a little bit by having them send this stuff to you, you know, and I think even Melissa, when we were in one district, she would spot check. She wouldn't look at every one of them, but she would spot check a district, or she knew, like the BA, they knew this school always had problems. All right, well, send me that stuff. This one always seemed to do it right. I'm just going to spot check so that you can address these recommendations, because obviously, ultimately, you don't want to put something on a corrective action plan that says something's going to be implemented. And there you are next year with that same recommendation. And what's the corrective action with the implementation? I'm going to do it next year. I'm going to do it next year. And then CUSAC's going to come in and say, well, you're saying it on your corrective action that you're going to do something about it, and you're not. So, you know, when I looked, I think that's the easiest area that I see, is just having them send you the stuff. You know, and we'll always say as auditors, you know, the school ends. Get those records in the board office as soon as you can. You can peek at them yourself, send them the reports. You know, there's different ways. We have a million, some are Excel, some use the software, some use QuickBooks, I've seen everything. But I think it's best if you standardize at least the decentralized ones, so they're at least standard amongst each other, to make things a little bit easier.
So Val, I just,
Yeah, go ahead. I didn't know if you guys had anything to add. Please
Well,
add.
I just wanted to mention that one of the things that I'm finding more commonly with student activities lately is where you have an analysis about club activities and there's negative balances. And, you know, sometimes they're only minor. Sometimes this past year I had a couple that were larger. So maybe just keeping an eye on that, you know, letting whether it's centralized, obviously you're keeping an eye on that. If it's decentralized, letting the, you know, different activities know that they should be keeping an eye on that. And we did have a question in the chat about student activities.
I didn't see one.
Q&A, I mean.
Oh, in Q&A? Oh. Do you recommend using purchase orders like CSI? Do we have, I don't know, I haven't seen it in systems. Melissa or Renee, do you use it within the system externally, or?
I
know
do.
you're internal.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a smaller district, so I do have a hand in the student activities. It's kind of split between two offices. But really, we do put on a purchase order, just running it through just like any other order. We require the requisition. And then if they're paying for a field trip, once they request for the check, they have a little kind of form to fill out to say, hey, I'm requesting the check, and give us their, you know, final counts and the final payments. And then my office takes care of it. But I do recommend the purchase order process. It just helps keep track of where that money is going, since there's a lot of movement a lot of times in the student activities accounts. So I use CDK, so I know it could be done through that. I'm not sure about, and I believe it can be done with Genesis as well.
Yeah, so we use QuickBooks to maintain our accounting in our office. Ours is centralized here in the business office, but we have a Google form that the staff would fill out to request a check, so that it goes through an approval process. So depending on the school that's requesting it, it goes from that individual to their principal, and then it would come to central office to then get approved before a check is actually issued. So it's not technically a purchase order, but it's similar enough.
A couple of things I want to add is, like, when the student activities it's decentralized and handled by the individual schools, I think there is a tendency to forget that just because it's student activities, it still needs to go through the proper purchasing process.
Mm-hmm.
And while, you know, we find a lot of cases where you're just missing signatures on, their type of vouchers. And yes, you can, there's certain claimant signatures, for example, that can be exempt because they're under that, 15% threshold, but when you make the bigger payments, like you make the payments for like a trip or a yearbook or something, it tends to be over that threshold, and they tend to forget that, oh, I need to get those signatures. And the other thing that I tend to notice a lot with the timely deposits, it's not so much as when they turn it over to the, for example, with the business office do the deposit, or the main office do the deposit. It's not really, it's deposited timely once it's turned over. It's really, we see a lot of instances when the advisors is keeping a hold to like a whole bunch of checks. And the way you would know is because when you look at the stack of checks, you see checks dated, March 6th, April 15th, May something, and it's all being deposited in May. So, I mean, you just got to be careful with that because there are theft. We've known instances of money being stolen from teachers' drawer because they're not secured, and that's where those checks are dumped. So you just want to make sure that you have a secure way. And then I know you keep reminding them that you got to do timely deposits. So I don't know what's the best way to kind of incentivize them to not hold on to checks.
Right. And then the other ones that I see is there's a lot of those little mini grants. The teacher might get a Staples grant really, those are grants. They're supposed to be accepted by the board as a grant. They're supposed to run through your Fund 20. We see them a lot happening in getting a deposit into the student activity account, and then the teacher just does something with the grant money. They're grants, not supposed to be going through there. Or the other one that I started popping up recently in some of my districts is especially I see it more on the high school side, where they have an activity like a club and they're awarding scholarships out of their funds. Were those scholarships intended when those deposits were going in? Or we just have $500 left in the soccer club, so we're going to give a scholarship out. And not how would the scholarships work? So I've seen a lot of weird things. We see a lot of weird transactions that do hit purely because they don't understand, or they don't want to put it through the proper channels because it has approval process. A lot of times we think that that's why those things happen, is because they have to get, a claimant signature, like Mon said, or an approval or a second signature on it. So they'll just run it through student activities so that they don't have to, So this area becomes of high focus, and I'm sure not uncommon, but like Mon said, this is where we see the most problems and have fraud. And if there was an issue of theft or fraud in this account, the magnitude that it happens in the public is so much bigger than the dollars that you'd be talking about, that it makes you nervous as the auditor, which is why we really do analyze these a lot and look at them. And a number of districts have recommendations regarding them because we just think they're a little too decentralized and lack of control.
And Val, I think that's important, with keeping the internal controls. That's why for my district specifically, I keep pretty much the same process. So this way they don't find it easier to go through student activities. If anything, it's actually a little bit more difficult to go through student activities on our end here, because it involves a lot more people. So trying to deter that easy way out thing is, very important.
We have a question. Is your QuickBooks Online cloud-based, or do you have to pass saved files?
It is unfortunately online, which means there is a monthly fee for it.
Got it. Or is it all the schools or just your biggest high school?
So we have one file for the whole thing. So it's just got sub accounts for each school.
Okay, so each of the schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not a separate file for each school. It's just one file.
Okay.
I mean, but one thing maybe you guys need to start thinking about is that, a lot of these softwares are going to cloud-based. I don't know how much longer QuickBooks is gonna be supported, like as a desktop version. So you might be forced down the line to convert to, on QuickBooks Online no matter
QuickBook
what.
Online.
Yeah, I've seen it also maintained in Quicken at the school level. Quicken also works, but it's not as I guess cumbersome for the everyday user to use
Right.
at the school level.
I
So
used
I've
to
seen
run
it.
ours through the Quicken.
Yeah.
Right, it's a little bit different. And then if you have like an online or they have access, is that something that you can then see as the BA yourself? Can you can you log into the same software that they're using and see what's going on transactionally? Or is it only they have to generate a report and send it to you?
So in that case where it was Quicken, it was on that computer and you needed to be on that
A
computer to do
computer,
it.
okay.
For currently we have ours on QuickBooks and it's online and I can log in and look at it
You
anytime.
can log in and look at it, which
Mhm.
saves the step of trying to
Yeah.
bring the records, but you can look at it remotely, which is an
Yeah.
option too. Because
Yes.
I just think anything that has a known level of oversight
Mhm.
becomes a little stronger on the control side. People
Mhm.
are less likely to not do their bank rec. If not, because if you don't get a bank rec for 3 months, you're gonna call them and say,
Yeah.
hey, you haven't sent me your records. I don't care. Like I joke sometimes that you might never even look at it. You might put it in your bin and never actually open the envelope, but you know that it's sitting there. Just sometimes knowing that they have to turn it over to you, make sure that it gets done and it's done accurately, because they're not going to send something to you that's not, not done or not prepared. And
Yeah.
you can just kind of maintain what's going on, because that gives you that level of oversight, gives you a little bit of control.
Mhm.
Have we answered all the questions, Katie, so far?
I think so. Yeah. All right, so now I guess does anybody have any? We did have, when we talked about when everybody was enrolling, there were a few questions that a couple of people had posed on those questions. Do we want to address some of those?
Yeah, the first one had to do with Amazon. So maybe Renee, you could talk a little bit about that, because we were talking about that before we came on.
Okay, so my comment when they asked about Amazon was I hate Amazon. For schools at least. It's not the same as personal. A lot of the packages that don't come with packing slips and the documentation that it was even delivered. But Amazon really started to change. They do have a business portion where now you can get your purchase order signed. You can set it up like a rec process. But it is important to remember as a BA that you still have to follow all the purchasing regulations and the limits within that. So I noticed with my staff, when I did allow it for a little bit, that they would just go to Amazon because it was easy. And then it put more work on myself and my assistant to be watching all the limits and things. So my internal control now is more for unique items. They kind of have to prove to me that you can't find it anywhere else, and then we'll get it from Amazon.
We use Amazon here as well. And again, like you said, it's the worst. I do not like Amazon for a school district just because, when you're using the business side of it, it's the online platform is sort of like a requisition. So the secretary would enter in put in a cart. It would be in the queue for so many days. And if it doesn't get approved within that time frame, it just goes away. So depending on the requisition approval process, sometimes people are on vacation and it just doesn't get approved right away. And then by the time it does the requisition does get approved and turned into a purchase order, the cart's expired and now all the prices are different. They have to redo it. My other thing is like you said, it's people want to go the easiest route and they don't look anywhere else. So we make them get a second quote for everything that they're buying on Amazon and prove to us that Amazon is the cheapest before we will approve it.
I mean, that's a good thing too, to make them get that second quote.
Yeah.
Because at that point, it might be easier just to use the approved vendors that we have that are on the co-ops.
I agree. I
Mhm.
agree. But for some reason, they are
Mhm.
stubborn about using Amazon.
Yeah, and one of the things I was telling Val and Heidi before we got on was I ordered one time novels, a classroom set of novels, and I got 2 books from one vendor, 2 books from somewhere else. They came in drips and drabs. Some came damaged, and at that point, since they have no packing slips, I didn't even know who to return them to get the exchange. So it just was very difficult on all of our staff members that are involved in checking in boxes and, you know, paying the bills and just even processing orders. It just became too cumbersome. So I
Yeah.
really just put major limits on it. But sometimes you can't help but to order from there. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's always been our issue.
And then we
For the
had
same thing, it doesn't have all the backup, the support, the reasoning, so.
our other question that came in before was about best practices for analyzing receivables and payables at year end, as well as booking proper accruals.
So how do you handle, Renee or Melissa, your year-end balance sheet and what you do? What do you do? Do you prepare a separate spreadsheet? Do you do any kind of analysis? Is it something you manage on a monthly, annual basis? How do you handle that piece?
So I typically would do that at year end. My receivables during the course of the school year is my tax levy, my state aid for the most part. And then once I know my extraordinary aid and my non-public transportation aid, I would book those at the end of the year. I usually have a spreadsheet that I file that I would give to the auditors at the end of the year, and I would tie out every single balance sheet account. So for my receivables, I would have a tab for all my receivables listing, you know, this is what's due from the state, this is what's due from XYZ company, so that I have a detailed list of everything that's on my balance sheet. And typically, you know, as you're closing out June and you're getting checks in the mail or you're getting receipts coming in, I would just evaluate those as they come in as to whether or not they belong in the year I'm trying to close or the year I'm trying to open, and then book those accordingly.
I agree with Melissa. I do something very similar. I do keep an eye on my balances throughout the year and make sure nothing is looking odd. You know, just a quick check. I may not do a whole big reconciliation of each one, but you start to know your own finances. And if you're negative on a receivable, might have something to do, you know, question yourself. But I really take the end of the June and I kind of back into that number similar to Melissa. I give my auditors a detailed breakout of what's hitting exactly on those balance sheet accounts. And also it helps for whoever's entering deposits into the system. A lot of those deposits might change around if you're booking some receivables at year end. So especially I know a lot of times with the food service, with your June payments coming in from SNEERS. I give the sheet to my assistant who, you know, enters the deposits, and she then knows which exact account to hit it on.
Right, that way, so if she's hitting it into a receivable in the subsequent year or putting into the current year revenue.
Yep. So it makes things a little easier and cleaner in the book so that you're not going backwards and trying to correct those entries, or you get more
Do you
auditing
both
entries.
do that for Fund 20 also and tie that back to final EWIGs?
Yes.
So you do that on the 20 side also, because that's also, I know from an auditing standpoint, where we see a lot of, you know, we feel like we're making a lot of, and we're going into the EWIG system and, you know, sometimes we're seeing it, you've already closed. Were those receivables booked? Were they not booked? So I just want to make sure, you know, like you're not only just looking at Fund 10, you're looking at Fund 20, you're looking at Fund 30, you know, anything, do I have my rock grants?
Yes.
Are they receivable? What's the status? You know, because sometimes I think, you know, we focus on Fund 10 a lot and we forget about the additional funds.
So for Fund 20, I usually do an analysis of the grants, especially on the federal side, because the receivable is basically the difference between your expenses and your receipts, right? So I always have an analysis, you know, what was my prior year receivable? Did I collect it? What was for my current year grants? What were my receipts versus my expenditures, so that I know what my receivable is that I need to book. And then for like the state grants, the non-pubs, you get that money up front. So then what are your expenditures against the receipts so that the balance that's left is actually owed back to the state so that I could book that payable at the end of the year. So I do a spreadsheet for each one of those, for those grants so that at the end of the year, I know exactly what my Fund 20 balances need to be on the balance sheet.
I guess sort of tying back to our payroll agency, is everyone looking at the end of the year in your payroll agency and making sure that any of the employee contributions are sent back over to your budget, because that could strategically change something if you're not sending it over monthly, if you're sending it over quarterly. Do you at least, even if the cash doesn't make it by the end of, obviously, you might not move the cash until July or August, even when you're closing out your books, have you booked that receivable, like basically booked a refund receivable to ensure that employee contributions are hitting the same budget cycle? That's, that's another one of those receivables that sort of does sometimes we see as auditors gets missed. We look at it and see there's all this money in payroll because the second half of the year hasn't been sent over. Well, that drastically, if it's a big enough number, could drastically change the an excess surplus number.
Yeah.
One of the things I do for myself is a nice checklist, because, it only happens once a year for all your closing things. I just do a nice checklist and I go down each one of them and check them off as I complete them, because you might forget about, extraordinary aid is coming or non-public transportation aid is coming. And, those are the little things that, once you close, then you have to reopen and redo your adjustment entries or wait for the auditors to help you with it. So, again, it's important to work with your auditors as well. They're here to help us, they're not here to be the bad guy and say, oh, you did this wrong. They want you guys to have a clean audit too. So make sure you work with them. They'll help you develop the entries to do at year end, so that they're not necessarily waiting until October when they come visit you to do them for you.
We did have one more question. It was about the PEA state aid deduction and whether about refunding, restoring that.
I have a meeting with PEA tomorrow at 11.
I said, isn't there a meeting on the books tomorrow about that?
11 or
PEA
11:30
piece?
or something. So
Yeah, that's what I thought. There was one in.
So I haven't heard on what they're doing.
Okay, because that's coming, because, and we actually talked about it here that, that at least at a minimum, the odd sum should split the 2 years, because maybe there would have been a little bit less because if you were spending, if your carryover was primarily from 2 years ago, you're using it now. If your carryover was primarily the money that you're really not supposed to be using in the current year budget, yes, you have to reallocate and readjust, but how are you supposed to handle it if you were actually already spent it? Because here we are, it's April. I would have thought that the carryover from 2 years ago probably was your spent first. So I think that was a little bit of a shock. So we were trying to figure out how, do we talk to them and say, can you they split the tuitions, like split the carryovers on the PEA at least into 2 years. I mean, I don't think they should have taken your grant money to begin with, but they chose to take the haircut, but they took it off of, I know for us, we separated it on the CFA schedules by the 2 years, but it's lumped together in the odd sum. So, we looked at that and said, we're seeing where they go, but I'd heard that there was a meeting. I guess you were allowed to appeal or a Q&A or something coming up tomorrow on the PEA piece. So, all right, well, I think that's almost all of our time. I don't see any more questions, but as always, we can't thank you enough for joining. I do want to let you know that we are planning our annual Preparing for Your Audit seminar. It is scheduled for Wednesday, June 18th, Katie, I believe is where we settled.
Yep.
So you should be looking to get that information out also. So if there's any areas between now and then that you really want us to cover at that session, please reach out to us. We will definitely take, all those information to go through and hold our annual meeting will be coming also. I can't thank Renee and Melissa enough. They were very helpful in helping getting us through this, and I appreciate all of your expertise for us. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
And
you
I
for
just
having
want
me.
everybody to start thinking about how much money they want to transfer to the reserves, because We won't be seeing you till June 18th, so some of you may have your last board meeting before that fact, so please make sure you make those transfers in June.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Have a great mess. And Katie, you will send out the presentations.
Yes, everyone will receive the recording, the presentation, and as Val said, if you could provide us your feedback, before June, that would be great. And thank you again, Melissa and Renee, for being here. We got some comments. You guys were great, open, experienced, and honest panel members. So we appreciate all your input, and to our partners. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.